thankful and happy that you were able to do that for us. And by the sounds of it, it's something that you've been doing for a number of years in a number of different places. But moving now into where you are now. So you're based in Shanghai at the moment, and so Teaspoons of Change as a concept, an idea, an organization is still very much bubbling in the foreground here. But you're based in Shanghai now more full time.
Yeah. So it's actually now on the back burner more than the front burner. So once upon a time that was my vocation. That's sort of what I did for quite a few years. But these days in Shanghai, I'm really fortunate to, during COVID, things changed and all that, as you know, the world changes. And so I picked up a role with, they're now called EIM, Education in Motion. But previous, and that this is quite a new evolution of the organisation, but they're the Dulwich schools. So there are about 7 or 8 Dulwich Dehong. Dehong are the Chinese version of those schools. And so this is an education body that is about trying to create a sustainable future. And so I've come on to be the group head of sustainability and global citizenship. So I get to work across 10 or so schools in China. We have a school in Seoul and Singapore. We did have one in Yangon, but unfortunately things haven't gone so well there politically and for the people. So that's on hiatus. And then we just recently also bought the green schools. So in Bali and New Zealand and a couple other spots. So I'm really fortunate to have landed in, a very sort of busy city and corporate environment of a mainstream school, but I love it. Like I don't know if I've had a more meaningful job at this moment in time. Previously, I've worked for UNICEF and Gates Foundation and lots of different organisations over the years, but to be in China in 2021, who's the highest emitter, not traditionally, but at this current moment, and working with quite privileged students, so we're fairly premium type schools, and so to be one of those sardines, this is a beautiful description for a person, but to be a little stepping stone in their journey as they grow up and they're trying to form their ideas about the world and how to be a person and a good person and all that sort of stuff, all the stuff you spoke to Anthony about, is just incredible. So I'm so fortunate to be based here in China at the moment. I really love it.
Yeah, and just as you were kind of talking through that, so your position is head of sustainability and global citizenship across it's almost like so in the UK we have multi-academy trusts, which are the same. Conceptually, seven or 8, I guess, schools in one group, as it were, and they will have someone who is overseeing certain things over all of the schools as part of that trust. I wonder, I don't know the answer to this, and I wonder if anyone listening might be able to help us out. I wonder if there's such a position, such a job that actually exists in the UK at sort of a trust level. I know sort of in schools you have kind of eco committees and eco coordinators, etc. But I wonder if there is such a thing in the UK. And as you said, you're in a privileged position of being able to kind of work between each of these 7 or 8 schools, and the students are sort of fee-paying students, and they have, you have the opportunity of shaping their disposition so that when they are in the working world or in the world themselves, they are mindful of the decisions and the steps that they're making. They may be, in charge of a business, or they may be in some form of industry where perhaps maybe there needs to be that kind of step back and kind of think about, okay, what is the impact of our supply chain on the environment, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, we never know where these things go. And whilst I feel it's, quite fulfilling for me personally, I have no idea what's going to happen. but we kind of work on the premise that we can be, we can only control our little slice of life in the world. And so where I decide to put my time, energy and passion is really important to me. So I kind of have a little mantra of the last many years is that I'm determined to not hate Mondays. In fact, I gave a TEDx talk on this a couple of years ago. And so that's always been my guiding North Star. And so if I'm hating Mondays, then there must be something wrong with what I'm doing or my job or life, or so something needs to change. But and it's not, that leap out of bed smiling and laughing and dancing on a Monday morning when the alarm goes off, but I do like to put myself in positions where I'm learning and engaging and trying to make a positive impact in the world in whichever way we can. So this opportunity for me, to be across 11,000 students, many hundreds of educators, is just a fantastic opportunity. And if you do find that there is a head of sustainability for those London schools, let me get in touch, or get them to get in touch, because I love collaboration. Global citizenship shouldn't be a competitive advantage. It should be where the whole sector is aiming towards. And I do find that we're pretty good at collaboration, around the Sustainable Development Goals and Global Goal 17, which is partnerships for the goals. So we go down that pathway.
And that's a great little flag, I think, as to where we could move on to next. We just a caller in the studio, Praveen from India. Hi, thanks for joining the show. I'm not sure if you still wanted to call in, but if you could, if you want to hit the call in again, if you've got a question for Darcy, or any experience of sustainability where you are in India. So if you want to call in again, then I can click the accept. I think I missed it the first time. So let's move on to the Sustainable Development Goals. You mentioned them there. Now, I guess if I can sort of, you may have to kind of correct the accuracy of what I say now, I guess. But the Sustainable Development Goals, I'll ask you to kind of introduce them to our listeners. Some of our listeners will definitely know what they are, but actually I've reflected on this myself, and having spoken to a few people on Twitter and a few other people that work in schools in the UK, they're perhaps maybe not as well known as they may be. And I'm in this bubble almost of working in working with service for a number of years, and working as a CAS coordinator and working in international schools, really. So they've very much been front and center of me and of my last five years, I guess, since 6 years, I think they are, aren't they? So they came about as a result of the Millennium Development Goals. So the Millennium Development Goals were started in the year 2000, and there were 8 goals, I think, in terms of all geared towards trying to reduce poverty and improve people's quality of lives. Now, depending on where your sources are, there was a kind of a mixed bag in terms of the success to the extent of those goals, which had a 15-year time span. But statistics such as lifting more than 1 billion people out of poverty, for example, has been sort of reported as a result of those goals. The goals themselves, though, and this is where I might need a little bit of help from you, Darcy. I believe the goals themselves were quite wide and quite generic, and they were kind of blanket percentage improvements for every single country, and it didn't really take into account the different levels of development and ability and capacity for countries to actually be able to make significant progress on these goals, particularly with some countries may have quite different priorities. So if I'm right in saying that, then perhaps maybe you could either kind of agree or correct me, and then let us know, give us a quick kind of intro into the Sustainable Development Goals, which kind of took their place in 2015.
Yeah, and that's the thing. The MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, are far lesser known than the Sustainable Development Goals, and they're a bit, development heavy. And if you're a geography teacher, you're pretty much the only person that would have ever seen the MDGs. But so you're right. I mean, but the thing about the Sustainable Development Goals, or they're often called the SDGs, which to me is far too close to STDs, and it's a boring term, and I don't like boring things, and neither does anyone else, because we're going to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. Cool. Well, I'm going to switch off to that for sure.
Yeah, it's a lot of big words, isn't it? That you kind of. Yeah.
It is, and it's and I've worked in that sector, and it's great, and there's wonderful people, but it's usually pretty boring in terms of community engagement or being very human and practical and useful. So the way that my aim for many years was to get the global goals more tactile and tangible and accessible and fun and interesting and engaging, across the world. And there's a great organisation based in the UK called Project Everyone. started up by Richard Curtis, the filmmaker, and his office is in Portobello Road. It is like being in a Richard Curtis movie when you go into the office. And they have the education side of that, which is the world's largest lesson. And it's fabulous. And so I've gone and worked with them from 2015 when the Sustainable Development Goals started. But look, anyway, they've got great resources, and they're trying to make those goals relevant, useful, fun, and interesting for teachers, for students, for parents, etc. But look, I'll take that step back and say, here these global goals, they're goals, okay? And I'll explain it to you like I do for year 2 or for, the corporate executives that are next door that I work with. And I've got to say that the explanation is pretty similar between the two. But for me, they're a goal. So if I want to run a marathon, I need to do some planning. I'm going to have to do some training, probably eat some good foods, blah, blah, all those sorts of things. So these goals, what they do is they help us to work together as a global community to solve big issues. Kalas, that's pretty much it. These goals, I can't go
out. So a framework, if you will.
Yeah, that's right. A set of goals or a plan. In fact, the best way I like to describe them is as a plan. So if we work together towards this plan, we can try and help end extreme poverty, reduce inequality, and protect our planet. So that's what it is in a nutshell. Now, they don't do anything by themselves. There's not a magic button that you can push and it does everything for you. It's really about how do I do what I can in my personal life through my teaspoons of change, and then how does that fit into the bigger picture in a global context or a collective context? So how's that? What do you reckon?
Yeah, no, that's great. And Miko's joining us from South Africa as well. Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio, Miko. We're just talking about the global goals or the Sustainable Development Goals. And Darcy's kind of just given us a kind of a precis really of what they are. And looking at them, there are 17 of them in total. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there in the way that they're a plan, but they're a starting point. Because when you, as a student, when you're looking at them individually, they are quite ambitious as well at the same. So, number 1 says no poverty, and if you're a 10-year-old student in England, like how can you possibly do something that can actually contribute towards there being no poverty in the world? And this is, I guess, where we come in with schools and education and how we frame the goals and how we I guess let's bring it all the way back to the beginning here, and it's how we actually establish the purpose of education. Is the purpose of education purely academic? Is it to make the world a better place? Is it to pass knowledge down from one generation to the other? And there isn't necessarily an answer to that. So in my last couple of shows where I've talked with service learning advocates and global citizenship, it's all been really about how we can do what we do academically within schools, but do that and interweave service learning and building positive dispositions as we go. So I'm going to pick up a little bit more on that just after the advertisements, and we're going to start thinking about how we can actually use the global goals practically and give our listeners something to kind of take away and maybe try in their classrooms.
Need support with your phonics teaching? Did you know Oxford University Press now has 3 DFE validated programs to help you? Read Write Inc Phonics, Floppy's Phonics, and the brand new Essential Letters and Sounds. Essential Letters and Sounds will get all your children reading well, quickly, using phonics books you may already have in your classroom. Developed by the Knowledge Schools Trust English Hub, it's affordable, easy to use, and makes teaching phonics with letters and sounds more effective. Whatever your school's phonics needs, Oxford has the solution. To find out more and receive support from your expert local educational consultant, visit oxfordprimary.com/phonics.
Hello everyone and welcome to the History Hotline, the hottest line for all things Black history and beyond. I'm your host, Deanna Lynn Cook, making space for honest conversations about Black, British, Caribbean and African history. Here to teach you all the things left out of your school books. Make sure you subscribe to the History Hotline on all good podcast platforms. Follow us on social media at the History Hotline on Instagram and at the History HL on Twitter to find out about new upcoming episodes.
Do you struggle with people pleasing? Is it a constant battle managing different and difficult personalities? Why not inspire, challenge, and empower your team through the MAL CPD Essential Coaching Skills for School Leaders course, or gain practical skills to become a strong and compassionate leader through the Assertive Leadership and the Emotionally Intelligent Leader courses. All MAL CPD courses are accredited by the Institute of Leadership and Management. Find out more at www.malcpd.com.
Welcome and thank you for joining us this morning on Teachers Talk Radio. We are talking global goals, we're talking global citizenship, we're talking sustainability, and I'm joined in the studio by Mr. Darcy Lunn. We have so far kind of talking, I guess, quite kind of strategically about how, what the goals are and what service learning can be pinned upon. And what I wanted to do really was just to kind of have a word with Darcy, and he's going to share some ideas, I hope, with things that he has done in school with students in order to kind of promote the global goals, but also actually develop these kind of habits and behaviors, etc., which all contribute these little teaspoons of change to affect, global change. Before we did that, I wanted to just put that we've had a few sort of tweets into the show when I sort of asked about the idea of whether, whose job it was to teach sustainability. Is sustainability something that we have to ensure that we build into our curriculum? Is it something that should be taught in schools but outside the curriculum? Or is it something that perhaps maybe should not be part of the curriculum? Now, I think I know what Darcy's answer would be, but just to give you some feedback from a couple of other people, Harry Waters says yes, 100%, but with the full support and backing of their institution and national curriculum. So I think that's a really interesting point there, and I wonder if Harry has gotten some experience of perhaps maybe he has tried to do so and yet not had the backing. If I interrupt my own self there, Darcy, do you have any ideas or sort of reflections about that?
Yeah, so to this point, the conversation's been great with you, Dorian. So we went through teaspoons of change at that personal level. We've then talked around the global goals now at that collective level. So what I do in the classroom, and for me, an audience that hasn't heard of the SDG, hasn't heard of the global goals or sustainable development goals is the perfect audience. And those who have, if this isn't new to us, then we can find new ways of explaining it to those people who haven't heard of them. But look, those two, so I use them as lenses. It's nice to do a lesson on the global goals and on sustainability, these sorts of things. That's what I call the kind of front-on work. And that's great. You might have a lesson or a unit plan or something that brings the spotlight onto that. But really, for me, it's more important to have the lens or a few lenses. So I'll maybe just explain three lenses. The first one is a collective context. And so at any moment of any class or any situation in a school, I believe that we can kind of say, well, what does this look like in a collective context? Like maybe a global context. If we're doing this, then what does that look like for one finite planet with 8 billion people on it? Okay, so you're bringing the lens right out from whatever you happen to be doing. You're just hovering right up at that big global level, and that's where you might make reference to the global goals. And again, there's 17 goals. They're a bit scary, a bit confusing, but we can just say, right, let's just use it as a lens to look from a bigger perspective. And then the flip side of that lens is, well, what does this mean to me as an individual? As a year 5 in the Midlands in England or in Qatar or wherever, Shanghai, wherever we are, what does that mean to me? And what about my personal choices, decisions and actions around this topic? So that's what I really encourage with educators that I've worked with for many years, is to use it as a lens. And then it can just pop up, in any moment of any lesson plan, etc. And then just the third lens that's come about from students' demand, particularly last year, is that lens of diversity, equity and inclusion. And I know you touched on this with Anthony, which is fabulous, and the Dulwich Pudong School and Dulwich Pushin, our Duhong schools, they do a fabulous job of this, and it's just growing and growing. And so when we're looking at these things, what does this look like from, the lens of the opposite gender to me, or a different gender, or what's it look like from a rural person or an older person, or someone with a disability. So we're kind of enhancing and enriching what we're already doing. And so I like to say that global citizenship and the global goals and teaspoons of change, it's more of a value add than an add-on. So it takes a little while to feel comfortable and confident with them, but then it becomes pretty seamless in the way that we approach it. And I often encourage teachers to have a set of global goals up in their classroom where they can make a reference to them, every so often. We don't want to oversaturate it, and then the students will start to do that as well. So hopefully how does that sound?
Yeah, no, that's really good. I think that there's again, well, you nailed it on the head when you said, look, there's 17 goals and they're all kind of seem quite big and quite kind of intimidating almost in a way. It's like, oh well, we're just going to have no poverty, reduce poverty, and how can individuals do that? So having that, I think Roger Sutcliffe in his Thinking Moves book was talking about exactly the same thing that you were, this idea of zooming in and zooming out of situations, looking at what things look like at different levels and contexts. So I think rather than it being part of a kind of an academic curricula, it's perhaps maybe more of a kind of mega cognitive process, isn't it, about thinking about the implications of things and thinking about the impacts of things and thinking about how your actions have consequences outside of your local area. And I like the idea of having the global goals as a reference point for students and teachers actually in a display classroom. As a geographer, obviously, I have them there. But interesting to think about maybe how, I don't know, in a maths lesson, it might be. Is that more of a challenge to try to link your day-to-day curriculum with the global goals?
No, not at all. And I love that opportunity. So, I mean, I'm a bit more practiced in doing this, but I'll sit down with any teacher and look at what they're doing. And I'll use physics as an example. They were looking at motion and the laws of motion. And they brought up something about seatbelts. I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. I happen to know the global goals quite well, but really it's like, what's the practical application of seatbelts and motion, etc. And actually so you've got the 17 global goals. They have 169 targets. I don't know all the targets off by heart, but I do know that there's one about reducing traffic incidents. So when they're learning about motion and seatbelts, we're looking at, well, okay, the whole world is actually trying to reduce traffic incidents. So that's an interesting thing. So if we understand these laws of motion, that gives us, a few more talking points to say why it's good to use a seatbelt. So you've looked at this as a global thing that we're trying to do. And you could, even if you didn't know the global goals, maybe to the degree that I might, because that's my job. But again, it's just kind of framing that. So, seatbelts. What if everyone in the world didn't wear a seatbelt? What if everyone in the world did wear a seatbelt? And then you do that, flip the lens and say, well, do you use a seatbelt? Okay, so when you're in the DD, as we have here in China, which I actually tend not to use, I tend to use public transport, but it might not have a seatbelt in the back. So you might have a chat to your taxi driver or someone, say, hey, it'd be really good if there was a seatbelt back here. We're trying to keep the world alive on the roads here. But it's so I don't force feed anything to anyone, but if you when you get used to doing this, it becomes quite seamless. And then that lens of diversity is, who gets to wear a seatbelt, and are seatbelts well designed for people with autism or muscular dystrophy, these different kinds of angles, or, who's the guy driving the taxi? How does he go, or she or they, sorry.
You need support with your phonics teaching,
etc. So,
yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, exactly what you said is that we're planting, so in a physics lesson, perhaps, or a maths lesson, we're planting these kind of questions almost, and giving students an opportunity to reflect and to, just to really kind of think beyond the curriculum, right? Yeah, I like that.
So something that's on the tip of my tongue, Dorian, are the good life goals as well. So the good life goals, you might want to throw a link into this in the show notes at some stage, but actually the website's not great anyway.
Right.
You have to bumble around with them a little bit. If you're at a Dulwich school, I could give you a beautiful set of good life goals, but these goals are an adaptation of the global goals. They're not particularly child friendly, but they're teacher friendly.
Right.
And so what they do is they correlate to the global goals. But they, for example, number 12, the global goal for number 12 is responsible consumption and production. If I say that to a year 6 student, I feel bored saying it, let alone them receiving that information. But the good life goal is live better. And so that's, in essence, what we're talking about when we're talking about responsible consumption and production. And so these good life goals are a really nice bridge if you want to get them to be more, personable and practical to our students and our teachers and our parents. So I use things like the good life goals, or I'm not sure if you remember back to PPAP, Pen, Pineapple, Pen, Japan.
I do, yes. I do remember the video.
Yeah. So that's right. He has his video with the global goals. And, if a middle-aged Japanese man wearing a leopard suit can relate to the global goals, I think every teacher probably can do that as well, even if they're a maths teacher.
Yes, wow, great. And so would you say that the good life goals are more, I guess, accessible, and I might not just say sort of primary, but more accessible in terms of a stimulus of a kind of a starting point of a conversation? We've been talking in a couple of shows about philosophy for children, and so actually using one of those good life goals, or the wording of it perhaps maybe has the potential to be more of a kind of a stimulant of deeper conversation and questioning.
Yeah, that's right. So again, when I said before, I have a set of good life goals up in the classroom, or I encourage that for teachers. I also encourage them to have a set of good life goals. Now, we're throwing quite a few concepts at people here, but they don't get too confusing. And some schools will delineate quite clearly. They'll say, right, well, from early years to through junior school, we're going to use the good life goals almost exclusively. But, you just make sure you talk about the global goals and the kids aren't too confused by things. And then they might transition, towards that in senior school, or schools will work it out for themselves. And depending on where they're at, we're all on a spectrum of sort of 0 to 100 in terms of global literacy and competency. So you're just going to use them where it suits you. Yeah.
And where do you feel, from your experience and your engagement with obviously multiple schools before you kind of landed and grew some roots in Shanghai, where have you seen examples of that being successfully? I mean, the problem is with this is that it's obviously going to be different depending on each environment. Each school is different, and the parameters and the culture and etc. But perhaps maybe you've got some examples of where you have perhaps seen the global goals weaved coherently through a curriculum.
Yeah, I've got a few favourites, and not necessarily the curriculum, just in the culture, I would say, more so than the curriculum, if that's okay.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So, I mean, I see it in all places and every place, but the ones that have been a little further down this pathway, and a couple of examples might be at NIST, the New International School in Bangkok, UNIS, the UN International School in Hanoi. So I'll give an example. In Hanoi, they have the SDG Guardians, and the junior school students, and their job was to go around the school and find out where they could add the context of, that collective context of the SDGs into any part of their school. And the one example was students saw that the year 9s were going to make crepes for the school fair coming up. And they knew they were going to use Nutella because that's what they use every year. And they knew that Nutella may not use the most sustainable palm oil, available. So they dug around, they found some locally produced, chocolate spread, went and had a chat to the year 9s and said, hey, would you consider swapping out your chocolate spread? We've found this one. It's going to relate more to the SDGs. You can promote that at your stall. It's going to be more expensive, but, if we do some advocacy and saying why we're doing this, we think it's going to work pretty well. Teacher support added in there as well. They did that,
and also good for the good health and well-being, because it's also good for good health and well-being because it's free of nuts. So probably best to not have that on your stall at your fair, right?
All sorts of things. So look, I think you just go through your school with a fine-tooth comb, or actually a broad tooth comb to begin with, and then look, there's an unlimited amount that we can embed these things in.
And is that similar to what I guess people who are listening might think? Well, we do that. We've got an eco committee. So that might be something that they do already. But perhaps maybe now, following sort of listening to this, they could think about actually using the global goals or the good life goals as a kind of a framework or a plan to start mapping a plan. And I think if you're kind of auditing what you do in a school in terms of sustainability, at the same time you're also thinking about perhaps maybe what you don't do, and then that can kind of perhaps maybe give some rise to some identifying some opportunities within the school of things that you're not doing.
Well, it's funny you might say that, Dorian, because at EIM we're doing ESG reporting. This is a very businessy type thing. It's environment, social and governance reporting that businesses do to show their shareholders that they're good for investment, blah, blah, blah. Now, I've known about this concept for a while, but I grabbed hold of it recently for our organisation as a whole, as a group, and then for our individual schools, because what I like about it is it sets the goalposts. What do we care about? What are we doing well? What aren't we doing well? And where do we want to be in the future? And so this is a framework that already exists in the business world, but how can we educationalize it so that it's relevant to our schools and to our students? And so when our students, go for their university interview or into a job or whatever they're going to do, someone said, they can say, oh yeah, ESG reporting. Yeah, we did that in year 4. These are concepts that most adults haven't heard of. So for me, it's about finding some of those frameworks and structures, but that's right. Like what's important to us and how are we doing on it? So it's not that everyone has to go and do ESG reporting, but these are different opportunities that we can grab and use for the better.
That marries very nicely with my conversation last week with Danny Mayer on the curriculum, the climate crisis curriculum, in the way that you're kind of building knowledge and understanding at such as early as possible, so that the richness of the discussion and the understanding and knowledge as you go through school just builds on that. So if you've got students in primary that know about ESG, for example, then that's something that's certainly going to help. It just kind of jumped into my head there about going back in the olden days when I did GCSE business studies, and we did what was the SWOT analysis, right? So what are the strengths, the weaknesses, and the opportunities and the threats. So it's that same kind of framework almost, isn't it, in terms of trying to identify within your school what are the things that you do well at the moment, which can marry up nicely with a global goal. What are the things that perhaps maybe you don't? Where are the opportunities? Where how can you build capacity to be able to be better at what you're doing already, or to address the things that you're not doing? And then the threats, perhaps maybe what are those barriers to that are going to get in the way of you kind of achieving those things. That's I think in general, just having a kind of some form of structure, because I think as we started at the top of the show, really, it's the global goals, so very big, very kind of big blanket, a big umbrella. But kind of in decoding those, deciphering kind of what they mean, and giving teachers and schools the capacity, ability to be able to kind of say, okay, well, how does this look in our school, and what can we do within our school to support students in becoming more concerned about the environment and more active, perhaps maybe in terms of social justice, etc. I think it's a big challenge, but I think as you've articulated over the last 40 minutes or so, where there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah, and these are real world applications, which is lovely, because there's a lot of irrelevant learning that we do in school sometimes. So I like the real world application to make sure that some of those more, I don't know, like sideways concepts have a living, breathing pulse in the real world. So yeah, it just takes a little bit of, like I said, comfort and confidence to feel okay about these things and get familiar with them. And the global goals aren't perfect. They're a bit neo-colonial, and so the main thing for me is to take ownership of them, because they're not prescriptive. They're not saying, right, you have to use them in this particular way. I like it when schools take ownership of them and look at, uncolonializing them and using Paulo Freire and all those sorts of, wonderful other tools that schools should be a part of, and making ownership of them. But the thing about them, so before I shoot them down after having talked about them for 20 minutes, is that, the world has agreed upon these goals. So instead of me throwing rocks at them, as might have done in my younger days and other people still do today, it's like, how do we adopt them, use them, take ownership over them, and turn them into what we want them to be? Because they are just a rough plan out there, and we can use them so they're relevant and useful to us in our context.
Yeah, totally. And having that kind of carbon copy of what they are, when you're going from place to place, it can also be really obviously beneficial as well, can't you? If it's already something which has been kind of like universally agreed. I remember as my kind of as a CAS coordinator, in CAS you've got these learning outcomes that the students have to reflect the extent of their progress towards, and one of them is global engagement. So I mean that was the shoehorn. I mean that was a slam dunk there, because all the students really had to think about is how is their project, how's their local actions, how is that helping them to kind of work towards one or multiple global goals.
Yeah, that's right.
Great. Darcy, we're hurtling towards the end of the hour. The time has gotten the better of us. I've got to do a quick news break, and then we will return just after the news and just wrap up, if you're okay to hang around.
Yeah, I've got one practical tip that I'd love to share, so I'll save it for then.
Ooh, we'll leave that on a cliffhanger then. We'll be back in 2 minutes.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
This is your latest Teachers Talk Radio News with Gail Glenn. In Scotland, from the 20th of September, all staff working in schools will be able to access a toolkit of LGBTQ+ inclusive teaching resources, and will have to complete a basic awareness course. LGBTQ+ history and topics will now be taught and integrated into everyday learning, making Scotland the first country in the world to make this mandatory. John Swinney, Deputy First Minister, praised the changes when they were confirmed earlier in the year, saying, "Scotland is already considered one of the most progressive countries in Europe for LGBTQ+ equality." Schools in Norfolk have been impacted by the ongoing fuel crisis, with some fearing the return to online lessons. Some children who rely on special school transport arrangements have been unable to get to class. A Norfolk County Council spokesperson said, "We are aware of a very few incidences where taxi drivers providing home to school transport have not been able to get fuel, and are doing all we can to ensure that suitable transport remains in place." School buses have been unaffected so far, but there are 13,000 pupils in Norfolk who are eligible for funded transport to school. Former local head Jeff Barton, now General Secretary of the ASCL Head Teachers Union, said, "The last thing schools need is the added pressure of fuel shortages, with the potential for this to mean that staff, pupils and suppliers are unable to get to school." Research conducted by SmartPurse has shown that despite financial education being included in the national curriculum since 2014, their children's financial literacy is still a concern for many parents. Guy Rigdon, CEO of MyBank, said barely a third of 7 to 17-year-olds say they have received any form of money lessons. We cannot continue creating generations of young adults who don't know how to save or make informed decisions. For marginalised groups such as girls and young women, the margins are just too thin. It drives inequality and blights mental health. This has been your daily education news briefing.
Thank you for that, Gail. And I just couldn't help thinking whilst I was listening to all those stories, how I was trying to link each of them to the global goals. And I think it was quite easily done, actually. And it made me think we're sort of teaching globalization at the moment in geography. And we're looking at the idea that CO2 emissions from both aviation and shipping industries account for about 6% of the global total, which sounds small, but as a result of globalization over the next kind of 15, 20 years, I think, well, 30 years maybe, that's going to double. And in cases of the aviation industry, that's expected to triple. And yet neither of those industries, the aviation or shipping internationally, appear on the COP26 agenda. So I think, today my guest and I, Darcy Lunn, have been talking about, what we can do on a very granular level in terms of addressing the global goals. But as I've kind of alluded to a couple of times in previous shows, it is very much a combination of the bottom up and the top down. And when we're kind of looking at kind of big international organizations and multi-governmental organizations, there really does have to be almost some sardining, as Darcy said in the middle of the show, that, it's all very well us individuals, doing what we can to make our changes, but that really has to be lubricate. It has to be, the wheels have to be greased, and we have to be empowered to be able to actually do certain things. And discussing things like the aviation industry and the shipping industry, etc. at COP26, it confuses me how that doesn't appear to be on the agenda at this time. We are nearly done. We're nearly done. Darcy has one nugget of advice for us to share, with something that hopefully our listeners can take away and use in school. So, Darcy.
Yeah, thanks, Dorian. Going over some of these big concepts and ideas, I really want to make sure I leave listeners with one practical tip. Is when you're looking at your lesson plan or unit plan or year plan, if you happen to be that well organised, what I suggest for our teachers in Dulwich and Duhong is to add some extra columns. So add in a column for the good life goals or global goals that lesson or that unit plan might relate to. And that's, just look at them. You don't have to dig into them. If you want to dig into them, that's fantastic. Try and work out which global goals might relate to that topic. Next column, how will you elicit a connection to that global goal? Is it going to be a provocation? Are you going to show a picture? Is it going to be a little video? Is it a guest speaker or, whatever? Yep. So you've got your column for global goal, column for the way you're going to listen. And then that third column is how can you do something that's kind of a bit wow? How can you do something that's a culminating point of that unit or that topic, so that there's something that's experiential for the students, there's something that's real world, and it just brings everything together. And that could be learning how to fix a tube on a bike tire, or a little bit of first aid, or just something that's quite useful but will easily relate to practical skills that are good for you and for people on the planet. So hopefully that's maybe a nice little tip to leave on. Yeah,
that's lovely. Catherine, hi Catherine, just joining us from Essex there. I think in the past we've had similar kind of suggestions about, okay, how do we want to promote something more within our curriculum? Well, we add it into our scheme of learning and whatever. So, and that is one possible way. However, I also think that you need CPD, you need training as well for staffs to be able to feel confident and comfortable enough to be able to kind of broach these issues regarding the global goals, right? So it's nice, definitely, to have the column in the scheme of learning, because it does draw attention. It's making the global goals more visible, and it's showing teachers as well as students really that there is that kind of interconnectivity and that interweaving of these kind of dispositions that we want to shape for the future. However, if the teachers are stood in front of the class don't feel empowered, I guess, to be able to kind of start these conversations, or feel comfortable or confident enough to kind of start some of these conversations, then that's certainly something. Would you agree that that's something? And I know that's probably what a lot of your work actually entails, isn't it? Trying to empower teachers to be able to spread the goals.
Yeah, I mean, I would never empower a teacher because teachers can only empower themselves. But what I would do is lay out different things for them to feel comfortable and confident, because these are big concepts. And if we can just look at it a really tactile, useful, interesting way, then they're going to become a part of our lesson. So for me, it is making sure that it's interesting and easy and accessible. So that's why I created Teaspoons of Change, and that's why I talk about the global goals sometimes a little bit offhandedly as a fun thing or interesting thing. But that's what gets us into the game and keeps them bubbling along and popping up unexpectedly. Is when I love seeing examples where they just sort of rear their head when you wouldn't normally expect to see them. It's fantastic.
Oh, well, Darcy, it has been the most enjoyable hour talking these things through with you, and it has gone really quickly, but I hope we've managed to kind of go through a number of things pertaining to the global goals. It's been fascinating hearing about your journey in education and with these goals, and as I said, having met you and worked with you in the past before, I really can have absolutely it's been fantastic working with you, and your enthusiasm and your energy and the way in which you go about communicating to staff and to students in schools really has had a positive impact on the schools that I've been working with. So I'd like to thank you for that, and I'd like to thank you for that, and thank you for your time on Teachers Talk Radio. We will be putting a number of the links, etc., that you've referred to in our show notes. And I think it's time now for you to go off and have a relaxation after your 50k run this morning.
Thanks, Dorian. Great to connect with you and all the listeners. I will be taking a relaxing evening. Cheers.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Darcy. Take care. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.